Welcome everyone and good evening. Welcome to this David Goodbourn annual lecture. My name is Clara Rushbrook. I'm co-director of the Centre for Theology and Justice and co-principal of Northern Baptist College and a tutor at the Luther King Centre. So on behalf of the Centre for Theology and Justice, I'd like to welcome you. The Centre for Theology and Justice is a collaborative initiative to encourage, support and facilitate theological reflection on current issues of justice. It's a joint initiative of Christian Aid, Church Action and Poverty, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, and the Luther King Centre for Theology and Ministry. This lecture is named after David Goodbourn. David was a former president of what is now the newly named Luther King Centre, and a former General Secretary of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. He also served on the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches. David, as you can see, was passionate about both theological education and ecumenism, driven by a deep concern for issues of justice. I was privileged to know David in the last few years of his life, mostly on train journeys to National Baptist meetings in Didcot, where his humour and his courage as he faced his own mortality was an inspiration to me and continues to be an inspiration to many of our students as they encounter his words, his reflections in one of the sessions I teach on theology themes. So just a few introductions before we hand over to Anthony. Reverend Dr. Graham Adams is here with us as well. He is a tutor at the Luther King Centre and teaches on mission studies in the context of global Christianity and religious diversity. He has a particular interest in post-colonialism and understanding our contemporary context of empire. And Graham is with us because he is going to provide a brief response to Anthony Reddie's lecture this evening and will be facilitating our discussion for us. Just a note on some practicalities. Any questions or comments that you'd like to put to Anthony after the lecture, please type these in to the Q&A. There should be a Q&A button somewhere on your screen, probably at the bottom, and Graham will use that as a guide for our discussion later. So that just leaves me to introduce our speaker this evening, and I'm delighted to welcome you, Anthony. Anthony Reddie, who is the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture, and is a leading international scholar in the practice of Black theology within grassroots communities, and has a particular interest in education as a means of empowerment. You may well know him as the author of the book Theologizing Brexit, a liberational and post-colonial critique, and the recently republished book, Is God Colourblind? Insights from Black Theology for Christian Faith. More recently, Anthony has been involved in a number of research and writing projects. The first time I came across Anthony really was in his work with our Baptist family on their publication, Journeying to Justice, which marked 10 years since the Baptist Union of Great Britain made its formal apology to the Jamaica Baptist Union for their involvement in slavery and colonialism. And to bring it right up to date, Anthony has been at the forefront of helping churches reflect on and respond to both the Windrush scandal in Great Britain and to the Black Lives Matter movement. So welcome, Anthony. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us this evening.
Thank you. It's my privilege and pleasure to be with you this evening. I think before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the kind support from the Council for World Mission, whose financial support has helped me to develop this research and to write this paper this evening. And particular thanks to the Reverend Dr. Peter Crutchley, who's the Secretary for Mission Capacity within CWM. So the title of my talk this evening is Untangling the Legacies of Slavery, Deconstructing Mission Christianity for Our Contemporary Charisma. I will start this talk by saying a few words about myself. Like my all-time hero, James H. Cone, I believe that all theology is essentially some form of autobiography. I.e., what the theologian says and writes about tells you as much about them and their social location as it does about the God they are seeking to describe or discuss in their work. I am part of a wider community. The mass migratory movement of Black people from Africa and the Caribbean in the years following the end of World War II is termed the Windrush. This migratory movement commenced with the arrival of 492 Caribbean people at Tilbury Docks on the ship the SS Empire Windrush on the 22nd of June 1948. I was born in Bradford, West Yorkshire, to Jamaican parents who came to the country from the Caribbean in the late 1950s. As such, I'm a second generation Black Caribbean British subject. I was born into and nurtured within the Christian faith and within the Wesleyan tradition in a large city centre, Central Hall in Bradford. I apply my trade as a Black liberation theologian and a decolonial educator within Oxford University, but have lived in Birmingham for the past 30 plus years. I'm also a research fellow and extraordinary professor of theological ethics with the University of South Africa. I have shared these bare details of my life with you because I'm in a firm belief that all knowledge and all writing is embodied. And by this, I mean that there is always a relationship between the experiences that have shaped one's life and the resulting ideas and theories that emerge in any subsequent writing. Namely, that all knowledge and truth is contextual. All intellectual insights emerge from and are shaped by specific and particular times and spaces. Many of the enduring values of my life can be traced back to the formative years of growing up in a Black Caribbean home, living within a predominantly white working class trade union and independent labour stronghold of East Bowling. So in that context, it was a mixture of non-conformist Christianity, trade unions, and the Labour Party. All these went hand in hand. I am named after Tony Benn. My father was an actual trade unionist in the 32 years in which he lived in Britain before he returned to Jamaica, taking early retirement due to ill health in 1991. Whilst my formative years were largely pleasant and affirming, what cannot be disguised about my existence and that of many other people was the persistent reality of racism that affected the lives of all non-white people in the city of Bradford. I would argue that the consistent and persistent challenge that has faced Black people of Christian faith in Britain has been that of trying to get white Christianity to give expression to a non-racist articulation of the gospel when juxtaposed with the wide indices of racism in the nation. The former should be different from the latter, but far too often the two are synonymous, i.e., the nomenclature of Christian has often meant nothing when differentiated against the agency of white people in terms of the proclivity to engage in racist and white supremacy who do not go to church. Using the term white Christianity, I'm talking about people of European descent who form the majority of the population in this country, who believe in the God revealed in Jesus Christ, and who seek to give expression to the central tenets of the Christian faith in myriad of socio-cultural practices. So, talking about white Christianity, I'm talking about all various manifestations of church and traditions. The existence of racism in Britain today and in many parts of the world, of the so-called developed West, as we speak, is testament to the continuance of an underlying Eurocentric Judeo-Christian framework that has invariably caricatured Africans as less than and as the other, and has often done that when placed alongside white Euro-American perspectives that are seen as the apex of human civilization. The notion that human beings can be categorized into a fixed set of identities, which characterize both human potential and capability, often affected in notions of morality and ethics. All this can be traced back to the first 4 centuries of the Common Era. It's during this epoch that the negative connotations pertaining to Black people as the other first began to surface in Christian thinking. The scourge of racism in Britain is nothing new for Black people. As Robert Beckford has shown, that there is a genealogy of racism that in European intellectual thought that has asserted a disproportionately negative hold on the life experiences of Black people. The construction of the binary of Blackness as represented as bestial and less than, and whiteness as the personification of goodness and the opposite of Blackness is a product of modernity. The chief legacy of the transatlantic slave trade was the unleashing of the rampageous and ravenous animal that is racism. The construction of racialized notions of fixed identity and restricted perspectives on Black human selfhood was indeed the dangerous offspring of the chattel slavery of the Black Atlantic. The outworking of an immutable hierarchical manipulation of humanity did not disappear when the Act to abolish the British slave trade was passed in 1807. The Act brought the making of slaves to an end, but did not end racism. Nor did it end the notions of white norms, and certainly did not end racial injustice. The backdrop against which diaspora African Christianity is rooted, therefore, is one that has had to wrestle with the privations of slavery and colonialism. Diaspora Africans have lived for hundreds of years with the continuing effects of the ongoing trauma of the epoch of slavery. The Mafa, a Swahili term relating to the African Holocaust, remains a site of deep-seated trauma within diaspora Africans, to which many Black pastoral and practical theologians have needed and attempted to respond. And this regard, I'm thinking of the pastoral work of the recent book by Andrea Johnson, who calls soul care, which has its equivalents in other forms of pastoral theology written by Black people of African descent. And it seeks to attend to the deep-seated psychological malaise arising from the epoch of slavery. Bishop Dr. Delroy Hall, a personal friend of mine and the leading, I believe, Black pastoral theologian in Britain, was undertaking important pastoral work looking at the needs of African peoples as they seek to make sense of their liminal experience living in post-colonial Britain. His work and that of many others have attempted to find some type of amelioration for the suffering experienced by Black and working class Black people in the African diaspora. In the wider context, in our present pandemic, we've also had to deal with the impact of neoliberal economics and capitalism under the aegis of the global economy. And this has continued to have long felt impact and travails upon Black people across the world. Using the term global economy, I'm concerned with the interconnected means by which countries undertake their economic activity. And this can be seen in terms of multi and transnational companies and how they operate. And quite often certain activities of these companies operate within large global markets where they seek to maximize their profit, often at the expense of Black bodies across the world. It's important that we remember the great work of Eric Williams and the way in which he locates the roots of global capitalism within slavery. that essentially once you begin to exploit particular bodies for profit, it then becomes axiomatic that those bodies don't matter. And in our present context, where we're talking about climate justice, you move from exploiting the people to exploiting their resources. So the heart of this paper is a critique of white Christianity and the way in which it both colluded with the transatlantic slave trade. And I'm arguing that there exists and continues to this day an underlying framework that has enabled many Christian churches to construct an ideology based upon an incipient racist theology that has assisted in supporting black chattel slavery, which was unhindered by any faith in God. And the outworking of this historical phenomena is one that can be seen in the development of Black liberation theology, and more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement. And at the end of, and toward the end of this lecture, I want to talk about the intellectual absurdity of needing to have a movement in order to assert that particular lives matter. Because if the doctrine of creation and the belief that all of us are created in the image and likeness of God means anything, then to be alive, to be a human being, to be a sentient being, is that your life matters. And yet we need movement to reassert what should be self-evidently true. And even then, that movement is still contested by many people who want to say that all lives matter. It's very interesting that all lives didn't matter until Black people then stood up to say that our lives mattered. And then lastly, you have a movement that effectively is trying to counteract this self-evident folly, or should I say this oxymoron of having to talk about Black Lives Matter. So I want to talk about the impact of Christianity on Black suffering. To understand the church's role in slavery, it's important that we go back to the period of European expansion, and particularly around the time of the Crusades and the violent conflict between Europeans and African Black Moors, Muslims. And this encounter leads to the intensifying of ideas around Christianity equals Europe, equals Christendom, equals white, versus non-Christians equals Africa, equals barbarians, equals Black. Arising from that dialectic, therefore, is the notion that Black people become the other. And the aforementioned is exacerbated by the fact that white Christianity is a violent religion. It is based upon a form of close monotheism, i.e. the Christian God is a jealous and competitive God that will not tolerate rivals and the other that worships other gods. This can be seen in a number of Hebrew texts, in which a competitive God instructs the people of Israel to commit genocide on others who inhabit the promised land. See the book of Exodus, chapter 23, verses 20 to 33, and the list of peoples overthrown in that, and also in the book of Joshua, chapter 12. So when you combine problematic tropes around Blackness with white exceptionalist forms of hermeneutics linked to white European notions of manifest destiny, you have the ingredients for toxic residue of epistemology that sees Black people as quintessentially the problem. This ethic of white mastery over those who are deemed the other, that this becomes the basis on which the roots of a colonially inspired form of capitalism is at play, in which Blackness becomes a demonized other that has to be conquered, subdued, and economically exploited. Effectively, Black people become removed from the body politic of civilized Europe of whiteness. Our exploitation becomes even more egregious when it's then allied to notions of biblical sanction and the belief that Black subservience is deemed by God's very self In the pre-modern era, when epistemological insights of power largely lay in ecclesiastical hands, it was the ability to determine the other as less than and a part of and an inferior part of God's creation that enabled white Europeans to create an ethic of mastery and control over black bodies. Tensions between religion, faith, ethnicity, and nationality are exploited by means of specious forms of biblical interpretation, forms of eisegesis, in which the main text to resolve the issue of justifying the enslavement of Africans from within a Christian framework comes from Genesis 9, verses 18 to 25, the so-called curse of Ham. That Noah punishes his son Ham by cursing his own grandson Canaan, the son of Ham, and condemning him and all his descendants to slavery. Since there was already a widely perpetuated belief that Africans and darker-skinned people were the descendants of Ham, the so-called curse of Ham was used as biblical evidence that the enslavement of Africans was actually willed and sanctioned by God. There was also a similar but less well-known argument based upon the biblical story of Cain and Abel, Genesis 4, verses 8 to 16, where the mark of Cain, his sin as punishment for his brother, is interpreted as representing black skin. Now, it's important to say just very quickly that in both those texts, there was nothing within the original language that has anything to do with race, partly because race is a construct of modernity. It did not exist in biblical times. And therefore, what European hermeneutics were doing is reading into the text their already self-evidently created notions of blackness as less than in order to find a biblical mandate to justify the enslavement of Africans. Again, people of African origin are somehow identified as being cursed by God for some past wrong. Here, any notions of blame are removed from the slave owners, since it can be said that the condition in which Africans find themselves as slaves is due to their sins, due to the sins their ancestors committed in the past, for which God is punishing them, although it has been noted that no one has ever been quite clear just what exactly these sins were. And the aforementioned is later ameliorated by the Haitian Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And this leads to the charge to suddenly Christianize enslaved Africans. And it's undertaken on a number of biblical and theological terms, that there's a dichotomy between the body and the soul. This dualism, a particular outworking of Pauline theology, sees salvation solely in terms of faith in Jesus Christ. In this theological construction of Paul, fairness to Paul taken out of context, salvation is dependent upon not how you behave, but largely in terms of what you believe, i.e. faith in Jesus Christ. This means that if you are a Christian slave owner, you can have faith in Christ and still own slaves, as God is only interested in one's immortal soul, which is preserved through faith in Jesus. Your actions on earth are another matter. So for the enslaved Africans, faith in the same Jesus guarantees salvation in heaven, but not material freedom here on earth for the same reason as that given for the justification of the actions of the slave owners. Given this underlying framework of European superiority that still held sway, however, it held sway even when both black and white were members of the same religious code, i.e., both part of the body of Christ. It is no surprise, therefore, that when the slave trade was abolished and later slavery itself, Europeans continued to oppress Africans. It's interesting to note that on the back of the end of slavery, we then get the dash for Africa. That culminates in the carving up of the continent in the treaty in Berlin in 1885. Now I want to turn to the psychological damage that arises from Western mission Christianity. Inherent within the Black transatlantic slave trade of forced migration and labour was a form of biased, racialized teaching that asserted the inferiority and subhuman nature of the Black South. This form of anti-Black teaching was one of the most pernicious aspects of Western mission Christianity. And one can argue that the continued struggles of Black people in Britain and in other parts of the diaspora that arises from the era of slavery can be seen not only in the overarching forms of material poverty, but also in terms of the marginalisation of Black people and us still wrestling with our psyche. The African-American theologian Anthony Pinn has undertaken detailed work looking at the existential material realities of Black bodies as they existed within the phenomena of Christianity. In Terror and Triumph, Pinn rehearses a contested and troubled relationship between white slave-holding Christianity and Black bodies, outlining the levels of demonization and virulent denigration that provided the essential backdrop to the transatlantic slave trade. Outlined the apparent ease and the complicity with which white Christianity colluded with the epistemological frameworks of knowledge that underpin the machinery of slavery. Pinn says this, and I quote him: "In short, Scripture required that English Christians begin to think about Africans and an understanding that Africans have the same creator as them. Yet they were at least physically and culturally different, and this difference had to be accounted for. As we shall see, a sense of shared creation did not prohibit a ranking in the created order, one in which Africans were seen much lower than white Europeans." End of quote. This sense of a deep, prevailing anti-Black sentiment replete within notions of Greek antiquity and then practiced within Western, particularly English mission Christianity. It was given added strength in the deliberate attempt to use the developments of early Christian theology as a means of reinforcing the essentially depraved nature of the Black body. Kelly Brown Douglas, one of the lead African-American womanists, she demonstrates how a particular outworking of Pauline, Platonized influenced theology, the one that downplays the concrete materiality of the body in favor of the abstract spirit, as I described earlier, was used as a means of demonizing Black bodies. And Kelly Brown Douglas says this, and I quote: Accordingly, it is Platonist Christianity that gives rise to Christian participation in contemptible acts and attacks against human bodies, like those against Black bodies. Not only does Platonist Christianity provide a foundation for easily disregarding certain bodies, it also allows for the demonization of those bodies that have been sexualized and racialized. End of quote. One can amplify this prevailing sense of an incipient anti-Black strain within the corporate edifice of Western mission Christianity when one considers the ways in which Black Christianity itself has also internalized the strictures against Black bodies in their own corporate forms of religiosity. Anthony Pinn again, drawing on a similar analysis of Platonized Pauline influence Christianity, argues that Black Christianity is writing mainly about the United States. And he would argue that there exists, and I would also say within the UK, a strong prevalent suspicion against the Black body. That essentially Christianity has taught Black people to hate our bodies. and therefore has convinced us often to take on colourblind forms of theology in which in which the faith is indifferent to the lived realities in which we exist within the world, particularly in this context within post-colonial Britain. For many diasporan Africans, the search for a positive sense of self-esteem has been found, however, within the same Christian faith that has been problematic. That faith in Christ has provided the conduit by which issues of identity and self-esteem have been explored. This search has been helpful at one level as the frameworks provided by conversion and alignment with God in Christ has confirmed a new spiritual identity for Black people. But I would say that the extent to which this new formulation of the self has affirmed the materialities of Blackness is, I think, very much in doubt. As I've stated previously, the transatlantic slave trade gave rise to a form of biased, racialized teaching that asserted the inferiority and the subhuman nature of the Black South. The effects of such biased, self-serving instructions are still being felt. It's a continued tendency of Black people to internalize their feelings of inferiority, coupled with the accompanying lack of self-esteem. In an earlier talk I gave yesterday, I was given a humorous anecdote of once working for two Black Methodist churches in which, in both of them, in the vestry, they had a picture of a white Jesus. And in both contexts, I tried to remove the white Jesus and was almost physically lynched by many of the Black members who wanted to hold on to what was the authentic Jesus. And attempts to replace that with the Black Jesus was met with such hostility that I never tried that again. So who taught these elderly Caribbean people to hate a Jesus that looks like them? That's one of the legacies of mission Christianity that has impacted upon the psyche of Black people, and indeed is one of the legacies of slavery. Black British pastoral theologian Delroy Hall has written movingly and persuasively on in terms of the Windrush generation, describing our existence as a form of existential crucifixion. Hall argues that as diasporan Black people living in post-colonial Britain, we are still enjoying the horrors of Good Friday and our existential crucifixions at the hand of white hegemony through the privations of first slavery and then colonialism and then neo-colonialism and globalization is such that the exulting freedoms of Easter Sunday have yet to be realized. In effect, diaspora African people are still wrestling with the acute sense of being marred in a form of Low Saturday or Holy Saturday, such as socio-religious and political forms of liminality, of in-betweenness, that speaks to the transformative nature of redemptive suffering that has been grounded in our experiences, that has been anything but redemptive. A number of theologians have explored the theological significance of Holy Saturday and that in-between notion of being stuck between the horrors of Good Friday and the promises of freedom of Easter Sunday. But as I reiterate, the material freedoms of Easter Sunday have yet to materialize. So the continuing marginalization and suffering of Black people has raised some important, if not seemingly insoluble theological problems of trying to convert the agency of an omnipotent God with the ongoing negation of faithful people who have repeatedly called to God to end their existential travails of suffering, but to no avail. So the Windrush generation, of which I'm a part, have been able to fathom the mysteries of God's seeming inaction in the face of Black suffering. They have wrestled with that in the way in which academic theologians have wrestled with that for over 1,000 years, still trying to make sense of that which is intangibly a mystery. And so it is in this context that the theological apparatus of what I've called in the previous work a form of dialectical spiritualities that have been at play in Black Caribbean people seem to hold in tension, suffering and negation alongside hope and transformation. That this work is often a response to the persuasive Black theology critique of William R. Jones. William R. Jones, in his classic 1973 book, Is God a White Racist?, argued against the dogmatic certainties of God having any particular or special relationship with Black people, that is predicated upon God's active involvement in Black people's lives. So when Caribbean migrants first came to Britain in the Windrush era, they brought with them the legacies of a spiritual wisdom that came from Africa via the Caribbean. In arriving in the UK, so what enabled many of them, particularly my own parents, think particularly of my own mother, and what enabled them to cope with the experiences of rejection was this direct sense of believing that God was with them in their suffering. So long before Moltmann wrote his classic about the crucified God, there's a sense in which Black people were already living this out in their experiential sense of believing that God was with them in their suffering, because that was the only way in which God could be God. If God could not end the suffering, then God has to be in the suffering, or else God cannot be the God that we claim from the biblical tradition. In short, Black bodies, particularly those of the Black proletariat of the Windrush generation, that they represent, I believe, an alternative construct for what constitutes Christian normality in Britain. In the occupation of the politics and the faith and the theology of difference, I believe that they embody a critical resistance to the blandishments of empire and the toxic memory of the neo-colonial constructs of mission Christianity. That part of the emergence of the Black Lives Matter, Black people whose socio-religious formation has been shaped by Christianity were already in the business of seeking to refuse the specious biblical basis of their suffering. This leads me now to the next section, which is to talk about Black Lives Matter. The existence of Black Lives Matter movement is testament to the continued nature and the struggles of Black existence. As Dwight Hopkins has shown in his book, Being Human, the nature and recognition of Black humanity by white hegemony is a relatively recent phenomenon. I'll say that again. The recognition of Black humanity by white hegemony is a relatively recent phenomenon, and is still seen as quite novel in some places. So the trauma experienced by the Black body can be seen in the towering work of James Cone. And James Cone, as I said, is my all-time hero. And the corpus of Cone's work is seeking to speak to the need to rehabilitate Blackness and to form a theological hermeneutic against white supremacy. Black and womanist theologians have wrestled with the existential challenge of being a Black human being in a world that is all too often indifferent at best and incredibly unjust at worst in its treatment of Black people. In more recent times, increasing focus has been placed upon not just, in more recent times, particular focus has been placed particularly on the Black body as a central part of Black theological discourse. In making the point of departure, a focus on the Black body and the performative hermeneutics of style in terms of how Black people have lived and created forms of culture as indices of our humanity, that this form of work is a resistance ethic that seeks to give focus upon Black identity. Once again, I want to go back to Anthony Pinn and his work in the book Terror and Triumph, where what Pin does is to focus particularly on the Black body as a site of identity and humanity, as a way of moving beyond the legacy that was framed within Black studies by the great W.E.B. Du Bois. So Du Bois, in his classic book, The Souls of Black Folk, first published in 1903, he details a phenomenon he called double consciousness. In using this term, Du Bois articulated the psychological struggle at work in the consciousness of Black people, seeking to reconcile two opposing realities at war within the Black psyche. This dialectical struggle was one between competing notions of truth, whether in terms of determination, articulating an internalized form of subjectivity and a positive version of self that was juxtaposed with an external gaze of whiteness in which the Black person was reduced to an object with no internal meaning and no sentient sense of importance, according to white people. And this psychological struggle for many years was very much central to Black and womanist theologies as they sought to rehabilitate Blackness in the mind and the psyche of Black people. But actually, it's Anthony Pin's work that has been quite central in looking at the Black body and saying that actually it's in the body that one experiences this sense of rejection of our humanity. It's in the body that we face this struggle to be human. As I've stated in the previous piece of work, that I believe that to be Black and belonging in post-colonial Britain, it requires at some intuitive level a denial of oneself. That to be Black is to have our experiences, history, and ongoing reality largely ignored, disparaged, and ridiculed. It is to be rendered an insignificant presence amongst the many who are deemed our so-called betters and superiors. If we look at the continued ways in which Black bodies are objectified, it speaks to the enduring challenge seen in Black theology, namely one of trying to maintain our sense of human subjectivity. I would argue that this is one of the major legacies of slavery, is these forms of anti-Blackness that one sees replete not only within media, within legislation, but increasingly within the toxicity that one sees in terms of social media. Central to this struggle to overcome the negativity that's aimed at the Black body has been Anthony Pin's notion of complex subjectivity. That's an attempt by Black people to become more ample beings that transcend simple notions of fixed identity and objectification. Pin's notion of complex subjectivity speaks to the continuous struggles indicated by Black people to proclaim a form of humanity that is not compromised and confined by the limits placed on us by the existence of systemic racism and the dominance of white supremacy. I would like to remind us of the same contradiction that many Black people face, caught up in this dialectical tension between having to assert that our lives matter and yet still having to face the denial of that on a daily basis. This was first articulated, I think, in the most cogent manner, in popular terms, by that great artist, Louis Armstrong. In his 1929 recording, Black and Blue, he says this in 3 stanzas: cold, empty bed, head hard as lead, feels like old Ned, wish I was dead. All my life through, I've been so black and blue. Even the mouse ran from my house. They laugh at you, they scorn you too. What did I do to be so black and blue? I'm white inside, but that don't help me none. It does not help my case, because I can't hide what's in my face. How would it end? Ain't got a friend. My only sin is in my skin. What did I do to be so black and blue? Slavery is long gone, but anti-black racism that one sees on a daily occurrence on social media has not gone anywhere. In our contemporary era, we still see the underlying framework of blackness, which is still symbolically represented as a problematic other. And it finds expressions in most viscerally, a white police officer placing his knee on the neck of a black man. And despite the plaintive pleas of "I can't breathe," the officer remains unmoved and maintains his violent posture until that black man is dead. One cannot understand the futility of the death of George Floyd if one does not understand that this is not a new phenomenon, that white power has viewed black flesh as being disposable for the best part of the last 500 years. It's the reason why black theology came into being in the first place. However, in the last few minutes, I just want to highlight that this is not just an American phenomenon. I went on my first march in February 1987 to protest the death of Clinton McCurby, a young African Caribbean man who died when a number of police officers sat on his neck and on his back, and he died of asphyxia on the high street of Wolverhampton in the West Midlands. I went on my very first march, and we campaigned and we protested. The police officers were exonerated, and the coroner ruled it was an open death. On the 8th of June last year, we saw the pulling down of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. What was interesting about that, in the response of the media, which again tells us about the legacy of slavery, is that the major concern was at the desecration of property. And what that tells us about that particular moment is that another legacy of the slavery is that property has always mattered more than black bodies. And the roots of that, of course, go right back to the settlement to make us, quote unquote, free. So black people, those who were enslaved Africans, in 1833, in order for us to be free, the abolitionists had to effectively to recant on their decades-long challenge that human beings should not be enslaved because we were human beings. But in order for us to be set free, we still had to be then turned back into chattel, and a value placed on us of £20 million. And therefore, to be set free, we had to be effectively counted as material objects with a value, because that was the only way in which white people were going to set us free. And ever since then, what we have seen, even in the minutiae of the Edward Colston statue being pulled down, is that capital and material objects of money matter more than black people. It's very interesting in that if one looks at that as a microcosm. I worked for a year in Bristol, at Bristol Baptist College, and was on the very fringes. I don't want to over-exaggerate my importance in the campaign. I was a relatively minor, if invisible, figure. But I do remember being part of a particular group who lobbied for the addition of a plaque to Edward Colston's statue in order to name him as a slave trader. And apparently that was rejected because if the plaque was put on his statue, it would impugn his reputation. Now, here's the thing, the guy was a slave trader, but apparently to call him that would be unfair because here's a guy who has given millions to the city in good works, in property that is worth millions. So therefore, his reputation has to be maintained, and his legacy as a philanthropist, as a person of good works, of property, is more important than our feelings. I spoke on a platform and I was incredibly angry, and it took all my powers not to break into the kind of language of which my mother would have been always appalled, but I did do it. I did not break into such language. And part of it was in opposition to a right-wing conservative Anglican who still believed that Colston was given a bad rep because of all the good work he's done. And the point I simply made to him was, can you imagine how much money someone who colluded with the Nazis could do in order to whitewash their reputation? And would that then allow them still to have a plaque and for their crimes against Jewish people to be exercised? Can you imagine that ever happening? And of course, the truth is it will never happen. But the very fact that this statue had been in place for so long, and until as little as 7 or 8 years ago, there was still a memorial service run by the Anglican diocese in order to celebrate his life, tells you how little value we have placed on Black people, which then tells you about the horrors of the legacies of slavery. So my concluding remarks, this litany that I have outlined can only be overturned when white Christianity is willing to do 3 things. Firstly, we need an honest account of the history of slavery and colonialism. And by honest account, I mean not the self-serving attempts to justify British Empire as if somehow we have some kind of ledger to justify whether it was good or bad. Simply look at the impact of African communities around the world and tell me how one can even begin to try and parlay a notion of goodness coming out of empire given our present socio-economic realities that face Black people. So one is an honest account of empire and colonialism and slavery. 2 is the deconstruction of whiteness. The truth is that most white Christianity is in love with whiteness rather than in love with a Palestinian Jew who was not white, who's at the heart of our faith. Imperial Christianity has taught too many white people in white Christianity to think about whiteness as being sacred and not the Black other. And an example of that is simply from my own experience. I worshiped for 20 odd years in a Methodist church before it closed. And when I first went there in the early 90s, it was about 65% Black, 35% white. By the time it closed, you could count the white people on one hand. We didn't run them away, they simply decided to leave because at a certain point, even within the body of Christ, white people will do white flight and will move away to be with other white people. And the scandal is that no white theologian has ever thought that was worth writing about. We need to deconstruct whiteness. And finally, we need reparations. Not just money, although that is important, I think, for Black communities that are impoverished both materially and psychologically. But also reparation as a means of doing justice. That's one of the things that I love about the Council for World Mission and the work that they are doing at this moment in terms of reparation, which is just to acknowledge wrong and to understand that, for me, coming from probably like the greatest theologian of the 20th century, that's like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is the need for costly grace. And the need to repudiate the false consciousness of cheap grace that has too often been part and parcel of whiteness. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that. That's just been brilliant to illuminate things so clearly for us, and to challenge us as well. To do it with some autobiography, and to bring a framework to our attention, and to focus on the binary of blackness and whiteness and the impact of slavery on the pastoral care demands and on the economics and so many other things. And what was really standing out for me was the psychological dimension of this, and how that works, both in terms of the psychological impact on Black people and Black bodies, but also what you're getting at the end there is the psychological grip on white people too. And you know, as you refer to Council for World Mission, the definition of empire that they use, of course, refers to the colonization of consciousness, and that's just such a striking phrase. And I just wonder whether there's something you could just say a little bit more about how yeah, the constructs, the framework that we're living in has colonized all of us. It's not just a thing over there, it's something that colonizes all of us, and that's the sort of condition that whiteness, you know, could you just say a little bit more about that psychological grip that it has on us and how we're colonized, and that's what needs to be deconstructed?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a fantastic book by a womanist scholar called Emily Towns, and the book is called Womanist Ethics and it's a title. It's a Womanist Ethics on the Cultural Production of Evil. Womanist Ethics on the Cultural Production of Evil. And what she talks about in the book is the way in which the media in particular has become the means by which we have so much surreptitious ways in which whiteness is just dripped into it, it's fed into it, just on an ongoing basis. But what then seeps into our collective consciousness are these very subtle ways in which whiteness as the norm is constructed, and the way in which like demonization of the other just becomes this paraphernalia. Just two quick examples. It's interesting in that when a white person commits an atrocity, the first thing we do is to find out whether they're mentally ill. Is there some reason for it? In ways that we simply don't actually, when it's Black bodies, it's just a terrorist, it's just a, but somehow, and we do that because our understanding construct is whiteness is essentially good. A white person behaving badly is not a natural behavior. So there must be some psychological reason. It must be to do with some bad upbringing. Their mother didn't love them. There's some deep reason why they do it. And so we go to all kind of exhaustive ways to explain it away. And then, of course, crucially, that person's an individual. So even if they come from a far-right perspective, they don't produce all white people, it's just a rogue individual. Now compare that to how we then look at Black bodies. And by Black, I don't just necessarily mean people in terms of epidemics Black, I also mean politically Black in terms of particularly in terms of Muslims, for example. And suddenly one rogue individual is not a rogue individual. No, this represents a particularly dangerous ideology that needs to be policed and needs to be controlled, because essentially the underlying construct is that these people are bad, then this bad behavior is just representative of a whole group of people that needs to be controlled. And this gets perpetrated in all our media, whether it's liberal or conservative, because all of them are swimming in the same sea of whiteness. It then gets played out in forms of what sometimes people call microaggressions. Most of us as Black people have just learned how to edit out this stuff, because if you allowed it to find space in your brain, you will literally go mad. You will literally have a disproportionate sense of mental ill health, which we do have disproportionate forms of mental health. 6 times more likely that to be schizophrenic if you're a person of African Caribbean descent. And I think some of that is to do with the microaggressions that just comes with being in a Black body and being perceived as being a problem. So, so you talk to every Black person, particularly males, and they can tell you at that point when you walk into a shop and people are watching you because you're somehow more likely to steal than someone else, even though there's no evidence that that's the case. Or you find people holding their bags, or one occasion very quickly. Well, a number of years ago, an institution I was working at, and I was in a lift, and the woman was clambering with a set of heavy bags. That's why I held the lift for her. And I said, I hold the lift so you can get in. And she looked at me and said, no, it's all right, I'll take the stairs.
Thank you. Oh, we'll dip to the questions now because we've got quite a few coming in. So I won't be able to cover all of them, and 1 or 2 people have asked more than one. But Patrick asked one initially, Patrick Davis, to do with the Labour Party, picking up on the fact that you were referring to Labour earlier on, and how in the light of its challenges now, it says it's going to ditch identity politics, and whether you want to comment on the way in which identity politics is seen as a bad thing.
Again, I think that is part and parcel of the way in which whiteness gets constructed within our popular imagination. So, for example, no one ever talks about when white people, particularly those who feel disenfranchised, for good reasons, by the way, just to be very clear, that when they're mobilized around the construct of whiteness, that somehow isn't identity politics. Somehow, no, that's not identity politics. I still remember Jon Snow. I think to this day, I think he's still with the record number of complaints when he observed at a Brexit party meeting, mass meeting of predominantly virtually all white people. And Jon Snow simply observed and said, but what is it about white people that white people are so upset at the moment? And there was a record number of complaints saying, how dare he bring up that these are white people? But they were white people. But here's the thing, if whiteness is so normal, then identity politics is what everyone else does. It's problematic, but it's not what white people do, particularly when they vote against their own material interests. So I'm not saying that the Labour Party has it all right. It just screwed up on lots of occasions. And I've left it on 2 or 3 occasions as a matter of principle. I think mainly over Tony Blair's orchestrating an illegal war in Iraq. I left it then. So I'm not defending the Labour Party, but I find it interesting that when you are a materially disenfranchised poor white person, you think that a posh Etonian is going to have your best interests, and your best interests are you vote for him. What is that if not identity politics or whiteness that cuts across even rationality? Because it makes no rational sense that you would vote for that. But somehow your identity lies in voting for a white man who's going to look after you, but not in terms of class terms, or being alongside other migrants who are sharing the poverty and marginalization you face. What is that if not identity politics? It is, but of course, as long as it's white, it doesn't get called that.
Yeah, thank you. Sylvia asks, she says that Black people have endured so much, so many of our minds are still enslaved. What do you suggest could be done to wipe away this legacy and build up self-esteem?
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, so people sort of do 2 or 3 PhDs on this stuff. So I think just one very, very simple thing to do is, and I think certainly in terms of, I'll think back to the earliest work I did, this is the work I did for my doctorate, seems a long time ago now, is how we then teach Christianity within the context of a Black lived experience. As a part of that is to reclaim the African origins of Christianity. So to go back to early Christianity and to go back to the fact that its earliest foundations actually come out of the Alexandrian school. So long before I got to Europe, Christianity initially was very much an African religion. So therefore, we've been part of the biblical story for a long time. And therefore, then to have images that reinforce our own sense of self-identity, that it was the great Marcus Garvey, who was often seen as a political and a cultural leader, but people rarely give him any account of the fact that he also as well. He was soon that his movement was very much a Christian movement, founded around the around Ethiopian kind of Orthodox faith. And Garvey was one of his important dictums was that for Black people, we need to realize that God, and envision God as Black. Not that God is literally Black. We know God is spirit. We know that. But to say that you can never be free if the deity you are worshiping represents the people who have oppressed you. That simply just cannot work. And therefore, we have to envisage, if not God, then certainly Christ has been a person of color, because undoubtedly he was. And therefore, to identify the risen Christ as with us in our struggles means that Christ has to be Black. That's what Black theology has been saying for the last 50, 60 years. That's what I've written about. That's what James called supreme, that like the white Christ is the Antichrist, because that's the Christ who blesses empire and oppression. That cannot be the real Christ. The real Christ is the person of color. And actually, if we're saying that God, revealed in Christ, is where oppression is and where marginalization is, then Christ is Black.
Yeah, thank you. Chris just wants a bibliography from this because he's enjoyed it so much. Andy Thornton asks about that the white-led church in Britain is shrinking, if not dying. The Black churches around the world, particularly in Africa, are growing, but most of these don't cohere with white liberal Christianity. Can these ever coexist? And what can we learn about this from your work?
Yeah. And that's a really complex question, because I think the history in which whiteness has penetrated the world, it's not unsurprising that many of the fastest growing churches are, in one sense, more white than many of the newer versions of white Christianity in terms of what they've internalized from empire and colonialism. There is still a sense in which we have more in common than what separates us. And I think if we think in terms of praxis, if we think in terms of all faith is lived in particular social and cultural milieus, like there's no such thing as some abstract version of Christianity. It does not exist. It's always in a time and space. And therefore, if we attend to the common problems that we have that face us, that then becomes a way in which then we find forms of unity and cooperation. So, for example, in the UK, it is still a scandal that the 6th biggest economy in the world needs food banks, and we have people who have food poverty. And we know churches have been at the forefront of this, but what would happen if we found ecumenical ways in which both Black and white churches were both involved in this particular form of service? Equally, if we were being involved in schools, we need more governors in our schools to hold the education to account that does not educate significant sections of our communities. That it's not just about Black children, it's about a whole set of children in urban, poverty, poor areas. If we can find ways in which our ecumenism is not based on sort of trying to argue over doctrine, but actually to say, what do we have in common as human beings in a particular space, and what are the social issues into which we can join? Because most of these social issues don't differentiate between sexuality. They don't differentiate between what versions of Jesus or what version of salvation you have. If you're on the wrong end of the economic scale, they will oppress you regardless. Those are things around which we can join and find common cause.
Thank you. David Callender says that he remembers standing with you at the foot of David Livingstone's statue at Victoria Falls. Some revered it, some despised it. Do you feel that, as opposed to slavery statues, these reminders of mission should also be removed because of the view that it was white Christianity being imposed on the Black community?
I would always take that on a case-by-case basis, because I think in Colston's case it was straightforward, you know. I mean, the guy was a slave trader. That should have been taken down years ago. Things like Livingstone are much more complicated, because actually when you go to those different contexts, oftentimes it's Africans themselves who want to keep those things, is to say, actually, this is part of our own history and our own legacy. It was interesting when I was in Zimbabwe and I went to their Heroes Park. And actually, in their Heroes Park is a certain Cecil Rhodes. Now, Rose's legacy, I think, is deeply problematic. But actually, one of the things that a lot of Zimbabweans have said is that, like, we're keeping this here because he is still part of our story. If we keep the statue here, then at least then we can then still have a conversation around his exploitative actions. There is sometimes a danger of removing artifacts that has a danger of then not say removing, because actually no one learns history from statues, you know. I mean, that's one of the dumb nonsense amongst the many dumb things that our Prime Minister has said. Well, you know, if you take away a statue, take away our history. Who's ever learned history from a statue? Last time I checked, actually, we learned it from books, actually. So, no. I mean, I'm not necessarily for destroying them, but I am in terms of putting them into places of educational learning. I think part of the issue is when you have them as places of honor, as monuments to celebration. That's problematic. I'm not in favor of destroying them, but I think put them into museums where we can then have a form of education that acknowledges that these are contested. It's not always clearly black and white. Some legacies are very, very murky and muddy. But let's have a conversation about them. What we don't have at the moment is not a conversation. What we have is just a veneration around the myths of whiteness.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Edward Purris was struck by your reference to the suffering of Good Friday as being central to Black Christians' experience rather than the material benefits of Easter Sunday. And he wonders, has there been a misaligned focus on atonement theories and preaching on the cross rather than a full understanding of the resurrection as the key to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which speaks of freedom, release, love, etc.? There's a lot there.
Yeah, that's a pretty big question. That sounds like another book, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think the issue for many Black theologians is about a mistaken understanding around atonement theories. Because for the most part, Black theologians have largely rejected any notion of the cross as being sort of redemptive in terms of our salvation. I think this is much more of a lived social theology that says that whilst I think Black folk have a strong sense of spiritual freedom, there is an evocation of Easter Sunday. The problem is that that's not being seen in a holistic term that then is matched then by other forms of freedom, even freedom of self-determination. So, you know, I mean, so even early this afternoon, I had a thought, and I was going to put it on Twitter, and then I thought, no, actually, maybe I won't put it on Twitter because I remember what happened like to my friend Jarrell Robertson Brown, who put something on Twitter. And let's be clear. White liberal Anglicans have been saying stuff like that for weeks and months and nothing have happened to them. He puts it on Twitter and then has to go into hiding. That is part of the false narrative of says, well, actually, if Easter Sunday is about freedom, then we have certain freedoms. But there are a lot of ways in which our bodies are still constricted and we are still placed in a finite position of liminality. So I don't think it's necessarily about rethinking theologies of the cross, because I think Black folk have done that for a long time. I think it's how we then align that to our lived experience, particularly as it relates to white supremacy.
Right, thank you. Kevin Ellis picks up on, I think, your reference to Britain and post-colonial, and says, I wonder how far Britain can be considered post-colonial when those in power sometimes act as if Britain's post-colonial past has not ended.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's very, very true. I mean, I think I'm using post-colonial in a very sort of technical academic sense, which doesn't mean that we're sort of beyond colonialism. It's a way of saying that there is this dialectic, is this tension between technically colonialism has ended insofar as Britain has largely given up the empire. So technically, it's not a colonial country, but yet and Kevin's right, that all the tropes of colonialism are still in place, and there are still advocates who are pushing for neo-colonialism who are still around and are seen as respectable academics in doing so. And therefore, yeah. So post-colonial doesn't mean that we're beyond colonialism. It's just a condition that there's this ongoing contestation between the period where there was literally colonialism and the so-called freedoms that have come but don't exist. So yeah.
Thanks. A question here about reparations. So particularly picking up on what you were talking about at the end there, what are your thoughts and feelings about CARICOM's 10 points with particular reference to reparations in the Caribbean?
Yeah, that's a great. That I think is fantastic, and it's very interesting how little well known that is. So for those who don't know, like CARICOM has a 10-point plan, which is very, very carefully costed, but also it's very realistic and it's very doable. And actually what it's also linked to, and I think there's an interesting link to that, and in terms of sort of contemporary issues around climate justice, because again, that's part and parcel of it, that it's no coincidence that the places that are most vulnerable in terms of climate change are the places that were most exploited during the era of slavery and colonialism itself. And so this, I think, is a really positive way of affecting genuine reconciliation. Too oftentimes what we have, as I said at the end of the paper, is a form of cheap grace. So it's somehow, if we say sorry, although having said that, the British state still can't even do that, by the way. But but actually, if we say sorry, is this somehow like there's something magical in those terms itself, which has no biblical basis, because that's when we see like the model that Jesus affects, and the one I often point to is like Zacchaeus. That actually, in order to be reconciled with the other, one has to do repair. This is within. It's deeply etched within the Judeo-Christian tradition. One finds out within the Deuteronomy code as well, which Jesus just simply updates and reanimates within his own life, to say that without reparation, without restorative justice, there is no justice. And it's interesting that like we've gone almost seamlessly from the exploitations of black bodies and capitalism into the machinations of so-called free trade. That are just ways of reconfiguring white exploitation of black and brown bodies around the world. And until we have reparations, we will never have true justice and true reconciliation.
Thank you. Muketsi Motsisi says, thank you very much for this, and asks if a copy of the paper will be available. Let me just go to the next question. Yeah, Bob Fife asks, if God is where there is marginalization and oppression, and that's where God is God therefore also gay?
Absolutely. Or I think a more later theological context would say that God is queer. So queer is not quite the same as gay. And what I mean by that is that queer is a way of disrupting all the binaries. So actually, if we talk about the way in which Christianity is often constructed around notions of respectability, so you're this or you're this, you're in or you're out, well, queer then just disturbs all of that. And so, yeah, so I would say God is certainly gay, but actually God is probably queer, in that God is queering, is disrupting our settled sense of what is acceptable and who is acceptable and who's on the margins and who's in the centre.
Thank you. Oh yes, so Peggy asks about, you talked about reparation, but also about being honest, and wondered how you think this can be done, this being honest.
I think this is one of the key roles that the church can have, because I think one of the contested things about the church is that our involvement in slavery and colonialism is complex. That undoubtedly churches helped to bring about abolition, but as I showed in the paper, actually bad theology helped to sustain and create the frameworks for oppression in the first place. If we were able to model for ourselves a conversation that says that we know that Scripture says that love drives out fear, perfect love drives out fear. We have nothing to fear about looking at the dark side of our history, because we know that ultimately God is a God of justice and righteousness and love, and in Christ there is a mandate for reconciliation, but it's reconciliation that's predicated on justice. If we were able to model that ourselves and say, actually within our own life we are wrestling, much as CWM does, I mean, so both you and I have links with CWM, and obviously I don't want to overly praise them, because obviously no one's perfect by any means. But I think that sense of how they are exploring in a very honest way through a number of the various consultations and opportunities for people to bear witness in different contexts of the world, to say, well, this is the legacy of slavery. This is the legacy of colonialism. It is a contested one. But I'm reminded of the great quote that comes from James Baldwin, who says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think the church can model a means of, let's face this past, and in the spirit of love that comes from Christ for each other, that we'll face it down.
Yeah, thank you. Vala Nicholas asked, do you think the C of E, being the national church, with the implicit meanings that holds of its own history with slavery, means that it will not engage in good faith with eradicating racism within the organisation? Did I read that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I understand the question, I think what the Church of England probably needs are some critical friends who will journey with them and will speak from a position of being on the outside with nothing to lose. Because I think one of the problems with a lot of our institutions is that we know that when you try to police yourself, it never works, And it's very interesting in that, the more powerful the organisation is, the more they have the power to police themselves. So who polices the police? The police do. Who polices doctors and surgeons? They do. Who polices the Church of England? The Church of England does. You can't police yourself, because your habits of wanting to preserve the existing status quo is much stronger than the desire for justice. Therefore, what we need, all institutions, are critical friends who love us enough to journey with us and to tell us the truth, and to say, actually, at that point, you're not being truthful. Actually, when you say that, that's just obfuscation, that's just cheap grace. So I think what the Church of England needs are critical friends to journey with it.
Thank you. Perhaps this just picks up on the last 3 points you made at the end anyway, but Rachel and Niall ask, what would be the top 3 things the historic white-led churches in the UK could do in the current context?
Yeah. I mean, I think they certainly have to sort of denounce whiteness. they certainly have to engage, and I think, in an honest appraisal as to how their history has shaped them in terms of where they are now. And then I think finally, through the ecumenical instruments, and I think it's very appropriate this is organised through CTBI, is a conversation with Black majority churches on their terms, not on white terms. That means that even where we have the conversation is important, because we know space is hugely important. That's one thing that comes out of Willie James Jennings's work. Space is never neutral. If we have a conversation, but you come to my house to have the conversation, then implicitly, no matter how much I'm going to be generous, we both know that the conversation is taking place on my terms. Too often times, our ecumenical conversations take place on white terms because we're doing it in white space. And therefore, that the Black people are turned up. And it doesn't mean that the white people are not hospitable. It's just that if you think of the language of host and guest. Mm. Therefore, if we're serious about that, it needs to happen on black terms. And white people need to be discomforted by being in a space that they don't control.
Yeah. I think we probably need to draw a close there, because there's one or two other things to do. But thank you so much, Anthony. It's been such a wide-ranging lecture and conversation, and thank you everyone for the questions, which also brought out even more. So it's been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Graham, for being brave enough to provide a response and for facilitating our conversation and our discussion so well. Huge thank you, Anthony. You've certainly got us thinking. That was really stimulating and thought-provoking, and I think that will stay with us for some time to come as we try and work through what this means for us in our church communities. I also want to say thank you to Michael McCure, who's there behind the scenes, who's been running all the technicals for us this evening. Thank you so much. It has worked incredibly smoothly. And then there is one last thank you that I would like to offer this evening. You'll note that there was a question from Bob Fife, and Bob Fife is retiring soon as both co-director of the Centre for Theology and Justice, and also from Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. So I've just asked Graham Sparks if he would say a few words of thanks to Bob.
Thank you, Clara. Just a few words. Bob, you have been a great supporter of the Centre for Theology and Justice since its inception. Representing Churches Together in Britain and Ireland in particular is one of the key partners. And Bob, we simply want to thank you for your commitment to, your involvement in, your resourcing of this Centre for Theology and Justice. As we've tried to begin to enable a deeper and more wide-ranging theological reflection on issues of justice, such as has happened so wonderfully this evening. You have been one of those behind this new venture, and we simply want to say how much we are grateful to you for that, to thank you. And as you retire as General Secretary of CTBI in the next couple of months, our prayers and our good wishes go with you for the next stage of your life. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Graham. A number of you in the Q&A have asked questions about bibliographies and copies of lectures. This session tonight has been recorded, so I'd suggest you check out the Centre for Theology and Justice website to get a copy of that, or the Churches Together in Britain and Ireland to listen to it again there. So I just thought it would be good to bring what has been a really exciting evening to a close with a few words in prayer, or prayer poem. These are some words by Odette Fulbright Fulson from a poem called We Are Not Done. Do not think we are finished. Oh no, we will never be finished. Never just done, until the light of justice is lit behind every eye. Do not think we will be silent. No, there will not be silenced until the world has sung the names of the dead with full throats and still we will sing on. Do not think fear is the end of us. Oh, you are broken in mind and heart if you even imagine that our fear for our lives is the end of this story. We are braver than you have ever conceived, and you will not be the end of us. We have come to take back the world that is the inheritance of better children, better lovers, better days. There will be love again, but justice is our demand now. You will not take us down. We are endless, firelit, determined, and we are coming for you. Do not think we are finished. Oh no, we will never be finished, never just done, until the light of justice is lit behind every eye. Amen. So thank you all for joining us this evening. It's a shame on a webinar that we can't see everyone, but it's been good to see your comments in the Q&A. So thank you everyone and have a really good evening. Take care.